Good morning and welcome. If you're joining us from home, we welcome you too. Today we're going to spend an entire class focusing on the word righteousness and its equivalent word just. When I say equivalent, I mean they're exactly the same word in both Hebrew and Greek, but translated either as righteous or just depending on context. If you look up righteousness in an English dictionary, you'll find a definition like this one. The quality of being morally right or justifiable. And when we speak of God, that definition is a fitting one. God is righteous by definition. He defines for us what righteousness is according to his own divine character. But what about man? Is man morally right? Sometimes, but not always. And certainly not as a matter of persistent character. We can speak of man as being righteous by definition only in relative terms. You can say, for example, that Job was a righteous man, as the scripture says, there's none like him in all the earth. You see, in a comparative sense, Job was righteous. But even Job, as good as he was not righteous like God, even on his best day. Compared to other humans living at that time, Job was very righteous. But he, like every other human being, was fallible. Imperfect. So we can't speak of Job as being righteous in absolute terms the way we can talk about God. Let's consider Abraham. He would probably be considered righteous in a comparative sense, but he certainly was not righteous in the absolute sense. His fallibilities were evident. We don't even know how many fallibilities he had because our information about him is limited. But just like every other biblical character we read about, we know he had some. And the writers of the Old Testament made no attempt to gloss over the infallibilities of the people that are written about in the Old Testament or New Testament, even if they were termed righteous. They were always forthcoming about those fallibilities, and here are a few examples. Noah and his drunkenness and indiscretion. It doesn't give us any pleasure to review these, does it? Abraham's half-truth. Joseph's self-praise in front of his family members. Judah's dealing in bad faith and his propensity to turn aside for a cult prostitute. Moses' self-glorification while acting on God's behalf. And David's adultery and conspiracy to commit murder. But that confuses us. Why? Because the word righteous is applied to several people in both Old and New Testaments. And Paul said in Romans chapter 3, there is none righteous, no, not one. Here's some examples of people who are called righteous in the Bible. Noah, Lot, Joseph of Arimathea, we know very little about him except that he was righteous. Abel, Joseph, Cornelius, John the Baptist. Notice that there are several people clustered around the time of Jesus' birth and in connection with it. Cornelius, or rather John the Baptist, Zacharias, Elizabeth, and Simeon. And if we include the word just, if you recall Jesus' earthly father, Joseph was referred to as a just man and not willing to make a public example out of Mary. And that word just there, by the way, is exactly the same word. He was a righteous man. Others were said to be possessed of a quality called righteousness. Some are referred to directly as righteous, others have righteousness. Here's an example from Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 to 14. And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it and cut it off from man and beast. Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, They would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord. So there seems to be a contradiction. Is there any such thing as a righteous man, or is there not? Paul says no, but the Bible is full of yeses. It's tempting to explain away this problem by saying that these righteous people were relatively righteous. That is, they were personally more pious, more moral, or better law keepers than other people. That would mean that God chooses people on the basis of their relative piety, relative morality, whatever that is, or relative adherence to law. Really? Based on what we know about Noah's life, is he the one we want to pick as a standing example of relative morality? But note, this is exactly the approach that the Pharisees took to righteousness. To try by their own merits to approach perfection under the law, exceeding, as they thought, the righteousness of others. Or as Paul put it, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So this kind of thinking is flawed, isn't it? Listen to what Paul says about his own experience in Judaism. Galatians chapter 1, verse 14. As I was advancing in Judaism beyond many my own age, my people, so extremely zealous was I for the tradition of my fathers. So when Paul was a Pharisee, he did exactly what the Pharisees did. He tried to excel in righteousness above his peers. That's what it was all about. It was about advancing yourself by becoming ever closer to the righteousness of God. That's what success in Judaism looked like. So back to the question, how do we make sense of this? If God is righteous, God's righteousness is not established by excellence in any of these areas, then what is righteousness after all? And how do we attain it? And how do we resolve the apparent contradiction in terms between calling flawed people righteous and saying none is righteous? To further confuse the issue, although I want to assure you that before the class is over, we will hope to bring some clarity to the problem. We have what to us cannot be but a strange usage of the word righteous by our English definition in the case of Abraham. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, the famous passage that Paul quotes in Romans, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. How can belief be counted as righteousness? A person is either morally upright or they're not, right? Either he's right or he's wrong. How can belief, or even belief on steroids, change the reality of a person's actions, making fallible people righteous? Do you have those questions? I certainly have had them. They followed me around for most of my life. But the places I looked for answers brought me no satisfaction for many years. Paul will teach us about righteousness and something about our own. But before he can teach us, we have to understand the meaning of the word as Paul might have understood it. That means going back to the Hebrew word, the word zedek, and learning what that meant to someone who is trained in Judaism as Paul was. If you want to know something about the Chinese language, you don't ask an American who knows something about Chinese. You ask a Chinese expert in the Chinese language. So for the treatment that comes in what remains of this class, I'll be relying on a definition that comes from the Hebrew dictionary, from the Jewish dictionary. It's a seminal work. Judaism has relied on it for many years as a sort of established standard in understanding the meaning of Hebrew words. Looks like I've lost my clicker. That's not good news. Oh, here we go. Is it a matter of which way I point it? Well, can you all help me back there? Can you advance the slide for me? Okay, we're going to go down to where we have a Hebrew definition of righteousness. Right now, next. One more click. Oh, yay. All right. The Hebrew word zedek comes from a Hebrew root, zadok. Is that really helpful? The word zedek means as it should be. And synonyms are normal and fitting. Stare at that definition for a minute. This definition might strike you as being a little strange, coming from the vantage of someone in 21st century America. But consider it as though you were a Jew growing up under the law of Moses. To us, the word normal, as applied to human being, might mean something like typical. And typical might mean fallible. So normal doesn't bring to mind righteousness at all. But what if you looked at the word purely from a biblical point of view? If a man were created in the image of God, normal would also be fitting, wouldn't it? Man, in his created state, would be as he should be. Or as God pronounced him at the time of creation, good. You might say that man was created as a righteous reflection of a righteous God, in God's image. But in a single act of unrighteousness, something that was not fitting, committed by Adam, the entire creation became unrighteous. Everything was misaligned. Nothing was as it should be. Mankind will live in a state of unrighteousness unless and until God puts things back as they should be. But there is an exception to this unrighteousness, to this unrighteous world with its unrighteous people, that will be understood by understanding the range of usage of this word zedek. Okay. This slide will give you some sense of the range of its usage in the Hebrew language. The word shows up throughout the Hebrew language in places that would not be anticipated except for our Hebrew definition. If we went by the English definition, seeing some of these things on this list would be really surprising, wouldn't they? It's easy to see, for example, how a weight that is used for making measurements, as you can see on the slide, might be righteous by either English or Hebrew definition. A just balance and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work, according to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 11. It is, according to the English definition, morally right and justifiable. It is also, according to Hebrew definition, as it should be, or fitting. But could you imagine that the word righteous could be applied to a path? Certainly not by our English definition. A path can't be morally upright or downright. It can't keep a law or have upstanding character. But it can be, according to the Hebrew definition, as it should be, which might be easy to travel. If a road was not easy to travel, then something's amiss and in need of correction. So you could have a righteous path or an unrighteous path, depending on whether it was properly aligned, properly made. So you see, this word is broader in its usage than we might have thought. If an offering made properly and at the right time was made properly and at the right time, the Jews would have called it a righteous offering. Sounds very Jewish, doesn't it? If a king is protective, open-handed, circumspect, and meek, he would be righteous. In the case of a king, this description doesn't need to describe his morals, although it might. But in the context of a king, he would have to be of a nature that would be expected of a king. If you were a president, in order to be righteous, you would have to be presidential. That would be fitting. That would be as the president should be. And the same is true of a king. So, in a context, the word righteousness can take on special meaning. It does take on special meaning depending on what is appropriate and fitting in the context. Speech is righteous if it's truthful speech, according to the Jewish way of thinking. Now notice that the form of the word is changed slightly as we mentioned the outcome of a battle. Now the word is tzedakah. If that word sounds vaguely familiar to you and you're somewhere about my age or older, you might know why that word sounds familiar to you. You remember a singer by the name of Neil Sedaka? Neil Sedaka his parents were Sephardic Jews from Lebanon that came to the United States, and that word in that context, in that form, is often translated victorious. So he is Neil the victorious, Neil the victor. So in a battle, the righteous side is the battle is righteous if the right side wins. You can easily see from Jewish history how that could be the case. When the Jews lost a battle, it was consistently because of something that they did wrong, some unrighteousness in the camp. But now watch closely. A judge would be considered tzaddik, righteous, if he consistently decided in favor of the right, if he was impartial and fair. He is as he should be. But what about the party in a lawsuit? And this is critical to our understanding of the use of righteousness as it appears in the book of Romans. He could also be pronounced by this judge to be tzaddik if he was considered to be in the right. Notice also that in a criminal trial, the defendant would be declared by the judge as righteous if he's innocent of the charges that are brought against him. Now note that the word righteous is applied both to the judge and also to the vindicated party. The definition of the word hasn't changed. It means as he should be in both cases. However, notice that in the case of the judge, he's considered righteous because of his character. It's who he is. But in the case of the defendant in a trial who wins the trial, he's considered righteous. He's pronounced righteous by the righteous judge. It doesn't mean that he's morally upright in everything else that he does. It doesn't mean he's always obeys the law. It means in this specific instance, he is pronounced the winner. He's pronounced the righteous. He's pronounced the one who's correct, who is as he should be, according to the law by the judge. What does that mean? What does it not mean? Well, it doesn't mean that the person's always right. It doesn't mean that he's a perfect law keeper. It doesn't mean that all the decisions or all of his conduct is right. It simply means that as it regards the trial, he's pronounced as being the party who is right for these specific purposes, righteous, tzedek. From this exercise, it seems to me we will learn two important points. When God pronounced Abraham as righteous, as he did in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, he was operating within the normal definition of this word, tzedakah. This was not an unusual usage for a specific purpose. Abraham was pronounced by the judge, if you will, as righteous because he believed in God. He was as he should be. Abraham didn't have to be morally perfect. No one is righteous in that respect. In order to be pronounced righteous, he wasn't. But he was adjudged to be fitting and as he should be. The reason God pronounced him as righteous, according to the verse, was that he unwaveringly believed God. Paul will go on to teach us clearly that man needn't be perfect, or a legal expert, or even particularly good at following a prescribed set of rules in order to be considered as righteous. He needs to have palpable, tangible, evidentiary faith. If he does, his life will be testimony to that faith. That's vastly different from saying we're righteous because of the good things we've done. It's also vastly different from saying that if we have faith, it doesn't matter what we do. That's not what Paul teaches at all. In fact, he will argue directly against those two viewpoints. However, it's entirely consistent with the notion that we cannot achieve this righteousness through rectitude. It has to be pronounced upon us. Instead, greater rectitude will be the result of a life driven by faith. See, that's different from it doesn't matter what you do, isn't it? It means that you will do differently, but the reason why you do differently is not to attain a righteousness of your own. It's because you desire to be faithful to God, and that faithfulness will drive you to upright living. Paul will teach us both of these points in the book of Romans. One, our righteousness is not earned righteousness. It is pronounced upon us if we have biblical faith, and you'll see that very clearly in chapter 3. Our righteousness, number 2, is not independent of what we do. Rather, what we do will be done because of faith. The latter part of the book, especially chapter 12, will be dedicated to showing what a life of the righteous will look like if we let our faith drive us. But very importantly, righteous through faith, properly derived, is vastly different from the English usage of the word righteousness. The English definition could leave us struggling mightily with Paul's teachings in the book of Romans. If you read in the book of Romans and you see that God pronounced Abraham righteous by faith, you might wonder, what does that have to do with Abraham's behavior? If it's a pronouncement, if it's by faith, well, Paul will say that it does have something to do with Abraham's behavior, but we often get the cart before the horse. And the Jews often got the cart before the horse. They often like to say that they were made righteous by their own actions. And when you say that, you have left out a very important component, the motivating factor that causes righteousness to come about in the first place, a pronouncement by faith that drives behavior. Understanding conferred righteousness, pronounced righteousness, or reckoned righteousness is central to understanding what Paul is saying in all the chapters of Romans. Faith is what motivates us to become what we should be. Let me take a break here and give you an opportunity now to ask any question that you might have or make a comment. I know that's hard to think of questions on the spot after somebody's been lecturing for 15 minutes.
The word justice, he didn't deal with very much, but when God or the judge makes the judgment, he pronounces as just or righteous.
That's right. So God is playing the part of the judge in Romans. But he said I didn't mention the word justice. And that's true. We're focused on the word righteousness. But God is playing the part of the judge, and we have looked at the role of the judge, the righteous judge, in judgment, and that is he's the one who declares justice upon the one who has faith, who declares, rather not justice, who declares righteousness. He declares that person is as he should be because of his faith. All right, anybody else? Giving myself a chance to take a breath. Let me refresh my vocal cords. We're about to turn our attention to the word righteousness, specifically as it appears in the book of Romans. How would righteousness be demonstrated with respect to a covenant? By covenant faithfulness. If you're faithful to your covenant, you are as you, if you're righteous in regard to a covenant, you are as you should be, and you should be faithful to your covenant. You should be keeping and fulfilling all the requirements under the covenant. What did we say defined righteousness with respect to a judge? A judge would have to judge fairly and impartially and judge in favor of the right. That would mean that judge is righteous. How would we define righteousness with respect to a law? One would have to keep it flawlessly, wouldn't they? If you're going to be considered righteous under the law of Moses, you'd have to keep that law flawlessly. If you're going to consider yourself righteous according to any law, even the perfect law of liberty, you would have to keep it flawlessly, wouldn't you? For God to be a righteous, generous king, how would he have to deal with those who fell short of the law? He would be gracious, wouldn't he? And he is gracious to the righteous. You'll see in the book of Romans that Paul makes all of these cases about God. He is righteous in every respect. All of his actions over the millennia have been righteous acts. No one can bring a complaint against him, and apparently somebody had, or at least accused Paul of implying that God was unrighteous with regards to some of these things. Even the law he created, according to Paul, was righteous, even if it brings about our unrighteousness, or it illustrates our unrighteousness. I picked out several passages here to show Paul's defense of the righteousness of God in Romans. I'll take you through those in a minute, but before I do, here's some of the things that you'll see as we go through these verses. Righteousness in the epistle to Romans maintains that God is righteous and that he's fair-minded, impartial, and faithful to his covenant. It concerns itself with the inherent inability of man, whether Jew or Gentile, to declare himself righteous through birthright, Jewishness, association with the temple, dedication to law, personal piety. In other words, none is righteous, no, not one. Neither Jew nor Gentile can attain perfection by any of these means. It establishes that righteousness is available to both Jews and Gentiles through faith. So let's simply read some verses together. Chapter 1, verses 15 to 17. So I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome, for I am not ashamed of the good news of Christ. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Watch closely. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. We could never have a full and proper understanding of righteousness were it not for the work that Jesus did when he redeemed us on the cross. Concerning God's grace, forbearance, and justice. This is a little more lengthy passage, but it bears down heavily on this idea that God is righteous, and this is one of the key areas where he makes the point of God's righteousness in several respects. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith This was to show God's righteousness, that God is as he should be. Because of his divine forbearance, he had passed over the former sins, those that were committed under the old covenant, were passed over because of God's graciousness. He was as he should be. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier. He might be righteous and the one who makes righteous of the one who has faith in Jesus Christ. Concerning the sacrifice of Jesus, in chapter 5 and verse 18, therefore, as one trespass led to the condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. Remember what we said about Adam? And how through one man's sin, the whole world became not as it should be, it became unrighteous. Now Jesus is going to set things back the way they should be for those who have faith. Concerning the law of God given to Moses, chapter 7 and verse 12. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Some people might be caught demeaning the law. The law was a good law. It was a holy law. It was a righteous law. It was just as it should be. What it did was it pointed out the flaws in the character of people because laws were added because of disobedience, right? So people were not as they should be, and the law is what made that clear. And he'll go on to argue that there's no way you can be justified according to a law that points out your own righteousness. If you're made unrighteous, if your unrighteousness is made clear by the law, how do you use the law to justify yourself? And yet that was a common practice, and it was the main hobby of the Pharisees, to show that they were righteous according to the law. And many times just rationalizing their own bad behavior. Concerning God's choices. I wrote Rachel up there. It's Rebecca was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. We'll talk more about what that means. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part because he chose the younger over the older? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy upon whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion upon whom I have compassion. He's God. He can choose whoever he wants to accomplish his purposes. That's what God does. And it doesn't make him unrighteous just because he said, this is going to be the one who carries my promise instead of that one. There's no unrighteousness in that. And this will be shown in great detail as we go through Romans chapter 9. And in verses 10, 1 through 3, concerning the righteousness of the Israelites. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God, they shouldn't have been ignorant of the righteousness of God. They were told about the righteousness of God. And seeking to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. What is that righteousness? It's the righteousness that's conferred through faith. We are as we should be through faith. And so if we then go to try to prove how righteous we are by the things that we do, we're trying to establish our own righteousness and bypass the will of the Lord and the edict of the Lord regarding our own lives. You can't get there without faith. It's that critical. Doesn't matter how hard you try, doesn't matter how good you can be, you can't get there without faith. All you can do is show how far short of God's will you can actually come. Here's the conclusion. Anybody have anything they want to throw in here? Questions you want to ask? application to the book of Romans. I'm going to summarize, try to capture all of what we've said up to this point in time. Man was created in God's image. Because of sin, he became unrighteous, not as fitting, not as he should be. Laws were added to regulate behavior and to apply divine guidance for living under less than ideal circumstances. Those laws did not make adherents righteous. Rather, they called out and brought focus to their unrighteousness. They made it clear by how much men had missed the mark. Man was not, indeed could not be, made righteous through keeping of laws that accumulated because of his own unrighteousness. That wouldn't make sense, would it? But there were people who gained God's favor, not because of their perfection in law keeping, but because of one particular trait they had that others lacked: faith. They believed, trusted in, relied upon God when others relied upon themselves or their own moral rectitude. God pronounced those as they should be who trusted in him and held the rest under condemnation of which they were worthy. The upshot of this, where the Epistle of Romans is concerned, is that God pronounced Abraham righteous. That is to say, a verdict was pronounced upon him, not because he was an excellent law keeper. The law had not yet even been codified. And not because he had achieved a high level of moral rectitude, although his faith most certainly led him to be more than he otherwise would have been. Nor because of his circumcision, but because of his faith, his unwavering trust in God. If you want to practice something, practice strengthening your faith. Because when we unwaveringly trust in God, God will pronounce us Zedek, as we should be. And our faith will lead us to do all God's will. With it, we'll be better than we are. With it, we'll do extraordinary things. Read Hebrews chapter 11. The things ordinary people did, fallible people, some of them deeply flawed. Samson is mentioned there. There's a head scratcher for you, especially if you're a Jew who thinks you achieve righteousness through law keeping. With it, we will do extraordinary things. Without it, we can never be fitting for God's kingdom. What questions do you have or final comments?
Excellent.
Thank you, sir. This is God's work. It's not mine. Yes, ma'am.
Galatians 2, and it says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. I've just been reminded of that verse over and over as you were speaking, and it makes so much sense because if the law could do for us and make us righteous and pronounce that, then Christ didn't have to come. And so we do not nullify that. We don't nullify the grace of God because, like you were mentioning before, the righteous offering, it was done at the proper time and in the right way. And Christ is that perfect offering. And so we don't nullify his grace and the righteousness that we're pronounced, not because of the law, but dying to our sins and living in him.
So Christ's sacrifice was the righteous offering, wasn't it? It was done at the right time, at the fullness of times, the scriptures will teach us. It was done in the right way. It was offered by the high priest, who was Christ himself. It was the righteous offering. So thank you. You're reading from Galatians chapter 2, verse what? Last verse? Okay. So we want to take a look at the verse that she was referencing. Take a look at that one. 5 minutes. That's for the parents to pick up their kids. What else do we have? All right, class is dismissed. Thank you very much for your attention.